Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on sustainability communication. Our series is entitled Sounds Like Sustainability, which always leaves us some room for interpretation in terms of saying sounds like sustainability, but it isn't. Or is it actually? So this webinar is a conversational forum. It's a space where we have an amazing guest again, and we will have a conversation with the guest. I will ask a couple of questions, but after this, we will definitely open up this discussion again to everyone who joins us today. So if you have any questions, if you want to participate in this conversation, you are very welcome to do that. Just for your background, this webinar is part of a series of webinars that we started last year in collaboration with the International Environmental Communication Association, the IECA, and the Centre for Communication and Social Change at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. And this is how wide this webinar and our conversation will span, from Europe to Australia to the United States. It is a great forum, and thanks Nadine Strauss for being here. It's amazing to have you here. And
thanks for the invite.
It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you. We will focus on sustainability communication, and on your research expertise in the area of sustainable finance and business communication. So that will be amazing, but I don't want to kind of spoil it. I would love to ask you to briefly introduce yourself, and then we get started with talking a bit more about sustainability and what it means and what it doesn't mean, and where it's used and abused as a term and things like that. So welcome.
Sure. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and also thanks for joining in. So I'm an assistant professor at the moment at the University of Zurich at the Department of Communication and Media Research. It's a tenure track position. Some of you might know that it's always a bit stressful, but my focus and my research is on strategic communication and media management. That's the entitlement of my position. But within that, I do focus more on the aspects of sustainability related to corporate communication, financial communication, but also other organizations like NGOs. Regarding methods, I'm using a variety. I'm also a big fan of mixed methods. So I do interviews, but also surveys. Now I start with focus groups and content analysis, of course, both automatic and manual. So I do try to always get a little bit of all kinds of methods that we have learned throughout our career.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And yes, this is about sustainability. And in this webinar series, what we always start with is that we are quiet for a moment, and I will ask you if there's anything that you can hear in your surrounding, any sound that somehow reminds you of sustainability, or is a sound that you somehow relate or connect with sustainability. Is there anything that you can share from your immediate surrounding?
Yeah, so there are two sounds that come to my mind. So the one thing is that you might see it here on the left side. There's a train track where trains pass on throughout the day. So this is on the one hand noisy, but on the other hand, it also reminds me of sustainability and the fact that we should travel more by train, using public transportation. And I also use the train every morning to come to work. So this is something. And then the other thing on the other side is more when I have my door open, I do hear the sound of our servers. So that's sometimes pretty loud, depending on the heat of the building. But that reminds me on the potential of digitalization for sustainability. And in fact, I'm part of a community here at the University of Zurich. With a colleague, we have built a new community within the Digital Society Initiative, and we focus on sustainability. And so the idea is to bring researchers together who discuss basically potentials of digitalization for sustainability in all aspects. So that doesn't just mean in terms of communication, but it could also mean, for example, for cities, for agriculture, all kinds of areas in our life. And it's super interesting because you learn a lot from this interdisciplinary perspective. And but yeah, some sounds, of course. I do have some plants here, but they do not make much sound.
Yeah. Which is interesting, because sometimes I feel like if they would make sound, or any kind of sound or noise, we would potentially pay a bit more attention, especially kind of
Sure.
and connect ourselves much more to our biological environment or botanical environment. That's great, and it's probably everyone can just briefly listen and think about kind of machines like dishwashers running here, which is I think always in our immediate surroundings are always those tiny little things that that remind us of something, and that at least trigger that we feel like, oh, couldn't we do better? So sustainability is already there as a principle that influences our individual behavior, at least on a kind of moral level, in terms of evaluating those things that we do in terms of their sustainability. But I'm very curious to talk a bit about sustainability and what it is in a very brief understanding. Like, how would you explain sustainability? How do you treat it? What is sustainability? What does it mean?
Yeah, it's really difficult to define it and bring it down to some extent, because everyone is talking about it, right? But yeah, I mean, we have discussed that also with my colleague recently in a paper that we wrote, and we have dived a little bit into the literature, and so we understand it, or I also understand it as a normative concept to an extent. And there are also some scholars and experts in the field that I really admire, like Kate Raworth, who has written this book on donut economics, where she's also talking about sustainability in a sense that we should live within our planetary boundaries, that we should also, that sustainability also means to basically live in a way that is brings justice to our generations that we live with, but also the generations that come after, right? So using our resources in a way so that we also secure a good life for generations that come after. So this is something that I think about, but it's very a broad concept and very normative in a sense, but I do think it gives us some ideas on what to strive for. And as you say, like, things remind us of the need to live more sustainable. And now you're experiencing a heat wave. We have a drought here in Europe through winter. So it's an everyday experience right now. And so keeping that in mind, I think, of this intergenerational justice and trying to incorporate that also in our daily lives is something that I understand in the sustainability. And so for me, it's also something that should be integrated in all parts, right? In your own daily life, but also in all aspects that relate basically to our work, to our family life, and so forth. And then when we speak about the research part that I do, this also then translates, for example, to corporations, right? So when you talk about sustainability, it's just not just talk, but it should become an integrated part of their business model and their business practices. So that's my definition.
Thank you so much. And it's really important to kind of unfold sustainability, or the process of defining sustainability or negotiating what sustainability means, unfold it from like an individual level to an organizational level and a societal level. And these like the donut model, or before that, those beautiful 3 pillars of sustainability, I think this was this very first phase. And the biggest challenge there is that it's really hard to define what is just, what is fair, like what would be sustainable. And there is a lot of work done, especially in Europe, with the taxonomy and all the kind of processes that try to define that. But before we go further down that pathway, because I know that it's something that you deal with, I was wondering if we could start talking a bit about the role of communication in the sustainability sphere, or when it comes to defining sustainability, when it comes to negotiating sustainability means. What role does communication play in this, or related to sustainability? Maybe broadly.
Well, to me, and probably for you as well as a communication scholar, it's crucial, right? It's at the center of how we define these concepts and how we actually make them livable. So we need to communicate them to make them part of our realities and part of our world. So therefore, I was just talking about this community that we set up. So of course, from every discipline, people have different understandings of what sustainability means. And so our job is also to bring them together and share their understandings and communicate with each other and try to find a common ground, and also provide an understanding for different understandings and interpretations of the word. And then on the other hand, of course, it's also so crucial in a sense when we talk about more effective communication. I mean, of course, there are scholars that talk about how can we communicate more effectively in terms of messaging and frames to make people change their behavior, change their perceptions. Obviously, we know that there's this attitude behavior gap, but still there's a lot of research in that field. And we do know that some of these nudging techniques do work to some extent. And this can be achieved by communicating different goals, different values, for example, using communication techniques like metaphors, storytelling, using emotions. So if we go a little bit more in detail, the communicative aspect of communication, then there's also communication plays a big role on how we understand sustainability and how we can actually put it in practice. So for me, this is always the starting point of arguing why our research is so important, because for me, communication is the linking part of putting the concepts into practice and make them livable and actually be able to act them out.
Yeah, that's amazing, because that is it is really interesting, because I think there are a couple of scholars in the field of media and communication studies or organizational communication that started to think about like if communication is maybe a fourth pillar of all this responsibility frameworks or sustainability framework. And then of course there are other scholars who vote or who stand up for an 18th sustainability goal, which would be communicative sustainability. So I think there are a lot of things that are happening since probably 2 decades now, and a lot of thinking and a lot of evidence that communication is crucial, as you said, and not only communicating from a corporate or from an organizational perspective about what they do in the sustainability space and how they understand sustainability and their own future, but at the same time to realize that it's important to talk about it and to have those communities, to have those groups, to first of all define and negotiate what it actually means for the local environment and for the situation everyone's in. We also probably know that there are a couple of challenges when it comes to communication of sustainability or of CSR and related activities and projects. So what might be the challenges, or are there any examples that you know that you can talk about? What are problematic areas?
Yeah. So obviously, I mean, greenwashing is the big keyword here. everyone is accused of and putting sustainability in their mouth, be it in the public sector or private sector, specifically when we talk about corporations. And so this actually was also a trigger point for one of my a new research line that I want to follow, which is on the net zero communication by corporations. So it's basically the goal that corporations place for themselves to reach net zero by 2030, 40 or 50, which means that they do not emit more emissions that they either save or they basically extract again from the air or with other methods, or offset, for example. And this term has just, it is so misleading in a way, because so many practices in the corporate world cannot be done or translated into being net zero if we are not basically changing how our energy system works and how we use and produce our materials, unless you rely heavily on offsetting. And there have been also recently some reports that offsetting is a really unreliable method of actually reducing CO2, and it's basically, in my view, also more like a kind of silencing your conscience and to make you feel better by paying off your debts in that sense. But on the other hand, and I'm always in between, because I don't always want to take the role of accusing the private sector and corporations for not doing anything, because I do think that and I know people who work in these corporations, and they are in the sustainability teams, and they are engaged. They want to change something, and they do their best. So there is this challenge of how you have this big goal of reaching net zero in any way, and how to put that in practice. And there's always, or usually there is this mismatch between what they communicate externally to their stakeholders, especially externally, and what they actually are able to do within their operations and within their corporate frameworks, be it in terms of regulation, be it in terms of what the resources they actually have available to, for example, renew their whole production processes, to investigate their whole supply chain and also adapt that to a net zero world. Plus, there's always the issue of staying competitive in the industry. So to stay on the market, you also need to kind of secure your sales, and that you can pay your bad debts and your bills, and provide also a job for people. So to balance that out and to basically find a way into a sustainable future, it's super difficult. And therefore we are sometimes very quick in accusing them of greenwashing, which is right, I think, if it's done intentionally, and if they're basically deceiving the public about things that they're actually aware of, that it's not green. But I think we should also acknowledge that there are many initiatives and many people who are actually serious about changing something. So this is a challenge, I think, especially in the corporate sector. And then I don't even want to start about governmental challenges of like introducing regulations and laws. I mean, this is also not my area of expertise. But it just shows that becoming or transitioning to sustainability comes with a big baggage of things to consider, and actually, being able to change.
I think it's, from my perspective, it leads us pretty much to one of your main research areas in terms of sustainable finance, because I think after years of a lot of aspirational talking in areas that are really, like, sometimes not tangible, sometimes not easy to understand, I think suddenly sustainability is now a big thing when it's about finances, if it's when it's about investments, and not only on a big scale, even on a very individual scale, where people start to think, okay, where is it actually that I put my money in?
Yeah.
So this is something where I would like to invite you to just speak a bit about maybe some recent research or what is happening in that space actually at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really trending topic in the financial industry, and I was lucky that I started this research already 3 years ago when it just kind of hit off. And I think, especially in Europe, this whole trend started when the European Union basically came together. They saw that there's something going on in the financial industry. People are now defining new investment funds with ESG, environmental, social, and governance criteria, and that they had the feeling like we need to do something about it and regulate it, or at least trying to provide a framework for it. So in 2018, they formed this high-level expert group where experts from civil society, NGOs, politicians, but also from the financial sector came together. And they tried to work out this framework, the EU taxonomy on financial investments. And so this was about the time also when I started my research. And of course, because we are communication scholars, media scholars, I was more interested in the way this is communicated, especially in the financial media to the financial audiences, but also partly how the banks and financial institutions themselves communicate about it. And so back then, of course, there were already some critics about, so what does this actually mean, ESG and sustainable funds? And I remember also in the first years when I started doing this research, I just, as a starting point, I looked at these ESG funds and looked at the composition of these funds and what companies are in there. And then I started wondering that they look pretty much similar to the ones that are not labeled as ESG. They are just weighted a bit differently. And you do still have these big tech companies. You have even BP or Shell in it, and these oil giants. And you start to wonder, what is this all about? And then I was in contact, of course, also with people from the industry, and they were very convinced that this is the new thing, that this is what we have to do. And I was still a bit hesitant. But yeah, so I also learned a lot in this process. Of course, greenwashing accusations are to the most extent or partly also valid. I mean, there have been whistleblowers from within the industry. We have Tariq Fancy from BlackRock, who was one of the first who spoke out, and is now basically, I think he has some kind of activist organization also, and some NGO where he's also basically announcing or like promoting his point of view of this whole trend. And then we have DWS, an asset management firm from Deutsche Bank. Desiree Fixler was here, someone who spoke up, who got fired for her criticism, but is now also very loud and raises her criticism against the industry, and is actively also involved in how to actually stop greenwashing and do something about it and improve the system. So there are things happening within the industry, and at the same time, it's also not, again, it's not that easy. So if you talk with experts, financial experts, they explain to you that, you know, it also doesn't really make sense not to invest or not put your money in these big fossil fuel companies, because what happens, according to them, is that if you have your money in there, I mean, yeah, this is true, that you can engage with the companies at shareholder meetings, at annual meetings. You can raise proxy votes or give proxy votes, for example, exchanging the leadership, which has happened at different companies so far already, and exchange these people with people who are more environmentally aware and are actually interested in changing the business model. So the idea to stay invested in these companies, to change the business model, is something that's very prominent in the financial sector. Because eventually what they say is that if you put your money out, there will be other investors who do not care about any kind of environmental criteria. and they will buy up your shares and they will stay invested and make money of it with no change brought about. So I understand this, of course, but to me, this is like, the criticism here is that how fast can you bring about this change by staying engaged? And what is the exit point for you as an investor, where you say like, yeah, I stay invested in BP and Shell, but if they not change anything until 2030, are you then dropping out? And what happens then? So it's a bit of it's not an easy decision. And yeah, this is a little bit about the industry and about the issues there. And yeah, so my research was then basically more focused on how the media reported about it. And I did a content analysis here for the German media landscape and for the UK landscape. And I wanted to find out a bit more overall how the topic is represented, with what kind of topics, what kind of actors, is it portrayed as an opportunity or more as a risk? And the analysis was from 2019 until 2020. And in most cases, the articles were pretty neutral in general. But when they specifically talked about the opportunities of sustainable investments, it was in most cases, I think more than 80%, it was a positive. So they always saw a new way of making returns, a new way of investing and safeguarding your investments and your capital. And there was very little criticism about it, especially in the German landscape. There was hardly any article in that time period that specifically focused on greenwashing in the industry. Of course, this has changed since 2021. So that was a bit before the whistleblowing thing came up. But yeah, from the journalism perspective, this was again kind of a hint that they did not really acted upon their watchdog role in that sense, and looking deeper into the industry or raising their critical voices and holding them to account. And parallelly to this content analysis, I also did interviews with journalists in Europe and talking with them with journalists who covered sustainable finance. And I wanted to also get insights about how do they write about sustainable finance? What are their sources? What is the process? How do they think about the whole industry? And yeah, funny enough, they were quite critical in general about this whole trend already back then. But at the same time, they reported that they find themselves in this kind of dilemma where, on the one hand, it is their job to basically report on what's happening in the financial sector, what new developments there are, what new trends. And in that sense, they want to stick to their professional roles in reporting as neutral as possible about this trend. Of course, having some citations maybe by some critical actors, but they rarely have the resources that they could do investigative reporting or doing some more in-depth analysis in that sense in their daily coverage. There are exceptions, of course, when we talk about more specialized financial news, the FT or the Economist. They have done more in that regard in the beginning. Then also some German outlets have followed up, like Handelsblatt. But yeah, in general, the takeaway from this research was back then that they did not yet fulfill their watchdog role. And what we then saw now 2 years later is that, yeah, the general perception of this whole trend is that it's greenwashing and that it's not really reliable what the financial sector is offering here. And then, of course, there was a huge trend and uptick in sustainable finance during COVID, which also then flipped over a little bit more to the US and other countries, Asia and regions like Asia. But now more recently, since the energy crisis with the war in Ukraine, this whole trend has actually declined a little bit, because what you saw basically is that all the big energy firms and the fossil fuel firms, they have, last year was one of their best years with the biggest returns. So if you were a smart investor, you put your money into these companies. So again, like this is also one of the criticism that this is what I've just find interesting, and I'm still intrigued by the whole topic, is that even though they also talk about sustainability, the underlying goal and what everyone is striving for, it seems like the financial sector, is just safeguarding your returns. And it's still in the name of capitalism and gaining the highest return, which is worrisome, I think.
Yeah, a lot to talk about. I think it's slowly time to invite everyone else to ask you a couple of questions, because I think you open up this beautiful whole scope of this topic, and you pointed to so many critical points and really interesting points. I have one question, and then I hand over to everyone who wants to join for a question. Like, we're trained media and communication scholars, so we do have a pretty, and we're trained in a kind of European understanding of media, or a Central European understanding of what the media should do. You use the word watchdog quite a bit, and I think this is an understanding that is kind of inherent to our thinking, what we expect from the media. What I'm always asking myself is if this whole greenwashing phenomena, that one reason that this is actually happening is that there is a lack of understanding and a lack of knowledge, or by the same time, a very high complexity of these issues. So it's very demanding or very challenging for a journalist to translate this in a way that people understand. So I think it is complex, like finance, and how this whole kind of capitalism and how this works is pretty complex. It's an issue that not everyone is interested in. Plus all the connections and all the it's really hard to translate that and to communicate about it in a media environment. And I'm not quite sure if you agree, but I think there is, like, the intransparency is definitely, it's like, to a certain degree, it's strategically implemented there, because this is too big and it's too nice. And sustainability can be so nicely abused, for sure, because it's still fluffy, it's still a lack of regulations, it's still a lack of policies, and it's still a lack of benchmarks where random people and smaller organizations and investing companies can say, okay, sorry, doesn't match the criteria here. So there is a lack of structure, there is still this fluffiness, but by the same time, isn't this just a very a topic that doesn't suit to the media logic? And because it's positive, it's nice, so it doesn't fit to the bad news or good news logic, and it's too complex in times of economic pressure and time pressure in the media and in the journalism world to actually really make it into mainstream, and therefore really I don't know, it's just one
no, it's a really good point, and something that I also talked about with the journalists, because I did some research in financial journalism beforehand, and there was always the issue when I talked back then with journalists that financial news is actually a niche in the whole news coverage sphere. Also, like, talking in gender terms, I mean, there are way less women who read economic news than men, for example. So back then already they were struggling with how to make economic and financial news more attractive to a broader audience. And the same goes with this topic of sustainable finance. So many of the journalists told me that it's super complex to put this topic into one article. And then mostly what they ended up with is these kind of, in the beginning at least, these explanatory articles of what does ESG mean, what does sustainable investment mean, and so how to make these complexities attractive to a broader audience is a challenge, definitely. The language being used, some terminology that people are not familiar with. And yeah, people are just, yeah, I mean, I started with this topic also in a sense of, wow, a financial topic or finance, this is too complex for me. But then at the same time, I was so intrigued to find out more about it. That's why I dived into it. But for others, it's kind of, yeah, pulling them away from these topics. But there was also something that I found interesting by one journalist who told me that when they look at their articles that are clicked the most, usually some of the articles deal with private finance issues. So, you know, how to put your money or how to secure your retirement and your pension and things like that. So these things are actually very interesting to the general public. So one thing that then they told me is that sometimes they try to make this topic a little bit more adjustable and framing it in terms of what it means for citizens or like normal retail investor, or what does it mean in your daily life, and how you can integrate that in your private finance. And so these articles are then triggering more interest. And then I think what we see now here, I'm not sure if that has already arrived in other parts of the world, but I mean, Credit Suisse, one of the biggest bank here in Switzerland, has just has experienced one of the biggest crises at the moment. So these kind of events, right, they also trigger interest and make the topic of finance very interesting. So you have articles now everywhere on the newspapers, online, and people are reading it. So it's just a question, do we need always a crisis to make people aware of defaults and yeah, mistakes in the financial sector and how things are regulated and acted out?
Well, I think what we definitely can learn from the COVID crisis is, yes, it tells us at least how much policy and how easy regulations can be put into place if it's really necessary. But I want to open the forum now for questions from everyone who's joining this webinar today. So just speak up and whatever you want to know, this is your chance to ask Nadine everything you wanted to ask, or any question that got triggered now with the conversation.
Hi, my name is Ruta. I'm from Lithuania. Yeah, I have one question for you. I don't know, maybe not very simple question. How to find a balance between greenwashing and corporate ambition? For example, I read in these days an article about if a company has a goal of becoming CO2 neutral by 2030, but it does not have a plan, it is some kind of greenwashing. But then, on the other hand, how then to set these ambition targets and not to be, you know, not to be a liar.
Yeah.
Maybe.
No, it's a really good
point.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I had a master seminar last semester with a couple of students, and we talked about that in detail also. And it is a challenge, but what I would always say is if you set yourself as a corporation this target, you need to know how to actually achieve that. And before you should do that, you should have clear overview of how your business actually works. What is your supply chain? What are the products? The industry is talking of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Usually what they report so far are just scope 1 and 2, which basically covers what energy they buy. Or, you know, if they have solar panels, or if they have some equipment that they buy, things like that. But it doesn't actually include the supply chain of producing material and products, selling them, and what eventually happens with these products in their use. So in that sense, already not reporting the whole picture is in that sense greenwashing, right? There are some exceptions that do like a good job in covering all 3 scopes. Some of them that I know are more in the energy sector, actually, but it is a challenge, and I would be very careful in setting out these targets for, first. And secondly, even if there are some question marks and there are some blind spots, you can still define a strategy of how to basically find out how to fill it. So of course, what many corporations are doing, which is not right, is that they just bet on the development of new technology, or using offsetting. But you should have a clear line of how you as your business could actually possibly change that. So for me, what would be convincing is that you say, for the next 10 years, we are investing X amount of research and development into a certain new technology, and be very specific about what that should be and how it should look like, but not just saying, yeah, we are hoping that by 2030 there's a new technology that makes our supply chain carbon free. So really thinking it through and being transparent, and then on the other hand also being honest about the blind spots. And it's also fine, I think, if you as a corporation, you do not set a net zero goal, but then rather say, we are aiming at reducing, I don't know, 80% of our carbon emissions. I mean, achieving this already would be super successful. And if you're just joining the trend of communicating net zero, that's an issue, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question. It's really, really interesting.
Any other questions? Any other ideas or contributions?
So I can ask one more question, maybe. Okay, about how to work with journalists. I understand that they should have an objective opinion in all topics, and then they always took another opinion. But I already, see that NGOs are working with journalists. They are doing small briefings, how to talk in specific topics. For example, in green finance. Maybe businesses also should do same small briefing with journalists, how just to learn them how to talk in specific topics. Maybe ask them not to bring another opinion, because sometimes I'm very upset when I read articles and realize that this another opinion is awful.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I actually think it's a good development that NGOs are briefing journalists on these topics, because in fact, I was working also in a communication consultancy, and one of our main job was basically to draft messages for journalists and also organize these meetings with journalists. So corporations are doing that themselves also a lot, just might not be that visible and talked about. But there are these breakfasts and dinners where journalists are invited and being presented the new corporate strategy and what they should write about in their next edition. And yeah, journalists can never be purely objective by already selecting their sources. They take some kind of stance. They try, of course, then to bring a source that might be in favor and then another one that is against. But even that is a conscious selection based on the availability and the relationship that they have already built up. I think, yeah, speaking for corporations, I do think it's also important that you maintain and foster this relationship with journalists and organize these events. But you should always keep in mind that a journalist should be, and hopefully is, an independent writer and journalist, and that it's his profession and his professional understanding of not just copy and pasting the messages of the corporations. Even though that's not always the case because of time pressure and resource pressures. Yeah.
I would like to add one thing. I don't know how it's definitely just starting, but media corporations started to see their responsibilities, so their corporate responsibility. And one thing that they started to do is offer trainings for their journalists in terms of climate change communication and climate change knowledge and expertise. And by the same time, they started to talk about sustainability, and there are more and more programs at universities of applied sciences, at journalism, media training institutions that offer courses not only on climate crisis communication, but also on sustainability communication. And it's really about those concepts and the knowledge to be then more firm or more educated when you go in these briefings as a journalist. Because yes, of course, every individual has an opinion, and then but the more expertise you have, the more knowledge you have in this area, the better you can the better job you can do by going to those briefings, going to those events and press conferences and ask the right questions and then present it in the media in a better way. So these trainings, and they started to happen, and I think that's a really, really good and really important thing. But just because,
yeah, I think also maybe if I may add, I think this, of course, we cannot speak about the whole journalism industry, and my research is mostly focused on the German-speaking area or UK and US, and even there, I just talked to not more than 50 in total, right? So it's a snapshot of the insights that we get. There are surveys around the world for journalists, and these education programs do exist, and they are open also for everyone around the world. For example, the University of Oxford also offers these journalism schools and educational programs where they specifically look at getting people from all parts of the world. So yeah, it's also one of their goal to broaden up this field and make it available. Yeah.
Any other questions? Try to be a bit time conscious. Nilüfer.
Hi there.
Hi.
Hi. This is Nilüfer, and I'm so happy to be here. I had connection problems. I hope my question is not repetitive. I heard that you mentioned we need more in-depth research. One thing I'm struggling with is that the research takes longer than market changes. You know, we need to do a background, and we need to do the case study. I don't know, gather data, do interviews. How can we increase the pace of research? Because sometimes we are, actually most of the times we are behind the market, specifically in the finance sector. So how do you think we can increase our pace and sometimes even skip some facts even in order to catch the market and be able to make a change before the opportunity is lost?
Yeah, So yeah, what I was saying beforehand was rather this in-depth research on parts of the journalists, right? Their in-depth reporting. So not we as researchers, but I can talk about both. So in terms of us as researchers, I do agree, and this is a bit frustrating to me. For example, the publications that are now coming out that I did, right, as I told you now, they were analysis of 2019, 2020. We're now 2-3 years later. So what's the relevance still of these analyses? And I mean, one way to overcome this is using new methods that are automated, that are employed, that colleagues of mine, for example, are using to scraping data in real time, right, and analyzing them. I think it's something different than to decide as a researcher what you want to do. Because of course we are in this academic system, we need to publish on the one hand, but on the other hand, you also as a personal researcher, you want to have some impact and want to contribute to society. So what I see sometimes some researchers are doing is that they have a side project, for example, they develop dashboards where they inform the public about media sentiment and media analysis on certain topics. They write short reports or blog posts or doing these kind of webinars, right? So there are ways to get some first insights out to society, even though it's not yet completed or not yet published somewhere. I would always like say that this is preliminary research and it's not peer-reviewed yet. But I think there are ways also to participate in these contemporary discussions. And then regarding journalists, I think this is a question of resources. So I think editorial offices need to offer more capacity and more financing and support staff to do these investigative reports. And we do see that also all around the world, that there are these consortia where they work, for example, we've seen with the Panama Papers and things like that, where journalists work across boundaries, work together on some topics. So yeah, it is possible in that sense, but then it's always a decision on what topics to focus on.
Thank you so much. May I add another question, if that's possible? Journalists in at least our country, they can work both ways. They either could be a threat to a business if they're not sustainable. However, they could be assets while they are responsible and sustainable. But academics, you know, us as researchers, we are not taken into account from businesses most of the time, even if we are proposing a good idea or we are asking them to give us information, you know. Do you have an efficient approach that we could take communicating to businesses, you know? Of course, communication skills could could help us, but they are personal skills. But are there any approaches that you would recommend?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I myself, I don't have many collaborations with the industry, but I do, like with one NGO here in Switzerland, I worked together with them last year in doing some kind of impact analysis. And that was a really nice experience because I conducted interviews for them and I analyzed it and I provided them with the findings, a small report, and presented that, blah, blah, blah. And I found it so interesting because we had this very close exchange and we were in touch about findings and all the research that was going on. They were super interested in putting the recommendations that I gave right into practice. So 2 or 3 months later, after I sent out the report and we met, they have actually put most of my recommendations already in practice. So that was really surprising to me, but I would say that really depends on the organization. And they are super agile, they are really like, you know, engaged and they have resources. So that is one thing. And then the other thing is really from experience, like if you're early in your career, really try to maintain your relationships with the industry and the corporations that you might have worked with as an internship, or I don't know, you have met them at some kind of fair or whatever. These kind of connections can always help you with getting outreach for your research. For example, when I go to conferences where also people from finance are, I try to tell them about this and that paper, and I send it to them, then I might get invited to talk about it, right? So it's also a bit, you have to show a bit initiative and seeking out these conversations. It will not come by itself in most cases.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you so
I think
much.
that was great because it really kind of overlapped with my last question anyway. Like, what can we do? What is our kind of role and duty as researchers? So I think that's a really amazing takeaway. So I would love to wrap up this discussion, but I hope that's okay, Nadine, if I offer that people can get in touch with you if they want to know more,
Of course.
or if they want to,
Yeah.
I don't know, just ask you more questions on this topic. And I'm very, very happy and very glad we had a great community today in this webinar. Thanks everyone for joining. The next webinar will take place in April, and I will spread the information as soon as we get closer to that. And for now, I'm absolutely happy to that we have had this great conversation. Thanks, Nadine. It was a pleasure. And thanks everyone for joining today.
Yeah, thank you very much for listening, for great questions, and yeah, reach out if you're interested. Happy to